Hello, I'm health educator Nina Bell, and welcome to the Sick with Success podcast. We're going to talk about chronic illness and how it affects organizations as well as individuals in the workplace. Joining me is the man who wrote the book on chronic illness and career engagement, Jason Reed. Jason, welcome to the show.
Hello, Nina, and hello to all of our listeners. Thank you for joining us.
For those of you who may not know Jason, he's an award-winning former journalist and manager who has been challenged by chronic illness all his life, and now he runs Sick with Success. It's a company he created to help organizations better engage their workers who have chronic illness. So, Jason, before we get into today's topic about the economic cost of chronic illness and the business case for change, can you tell us a little bit about the company you started and specifically your background? Because you look at things from a very unique point of view.
Well, certainly, Nina. I created Sick with Success about 3 years ago. And as you mentioned, I've actually worked with chronic illness all of my life. And what I found was, as I went through my work life, I really became aware that there was a huge gap between the reality that I experienced working with a chronic illness and the way illness was perceived by a lot of organizations. I realized most of the policies and even the assumptions that are in place in organizations around illness or wellness assume that when somebody gets sick, it's going to be like the flu, in that they will go to a doctor, they'll take some medication, get some rest, and then they'll come back 100% well. But, of course, chronic illness is not like that at all. Most people with these type of illnesses are sick pretty much every day. It's just a matter of degree. But the other thing to realize is many people can function at a high level most of the time, depending on what they have and their style of work. And, I felt that companies didn't really maximize the efficiency of these people or recognize their challenges to help them. Now, the interesting thing is, for much of the past decade and a half, I was actually a manager in a very competitive industry, which was television news. And it's very much a results-based industry, and it's also very public. Obviously, if your people in your department make a mistake, millions of people find out about it really quickly. So, it's obviously really challenging. And what I found was after I became a manager, I started realizing that many of my employees actually had chronic illnesses of their own that they were dealing with. Everything from depression, arthritis, multiple sclerosis, and many others. So what I started doing was I took what I had learned from working with chronic illness myself for years and helped them come up with solutions to their productivity problems. And this is actually incredibly successful. Our department increased productivity in key areas more than 100% within the first year. And, the quality of work that people were producing was really award-winning. And, I started realizing that, many of these skills were actually quite valuable that I was using. So I created Sick with Success to help other organizations and also individuals really be their best, even when they're not feeling well. So again, the thing I want people to take away here is that just because somebody has a chronic illness doesn't necessarily mean that they can't still be a high performer.
So true. So in addition to training managers and employees about chronic illness, you also work with executives and other professionals to help them better manage their work lives when they're sick.
That's absolutely right. I've had the good fortune of working with some amazing people and learning with some amazing people over the past couple of years. I was a student of Dr. Dave Logan from the University of Southern California, and he has actually a book on the bestseller list called Tribal Leadership. And I learned a lot from him. I also learned a lot from Dr. Mike Mandel, who is one of the world's foremost hypnotists and is also very good at getting people to understand motivations and the unconscious mind. So taking what I learned from them and also learned from many of the other experts that I interviewed and adding that to my own experience, I created the book Thriving in the Age of Chronic Illness, which I really think actually helps us to and challenges us to rethink the way we view health and productivity in the workplace.
And today, we're tackling one of the major topics you cover in that groundbreaking book. We're going to talk about why chronic illness is such a huge economic and social issue and how much it could be costing your organization. So, Jason, when we hear you say something like chronic illness, what do you mean?
Well, that's actually one of the first questions that people ask me, because for some people that gets kind of confusing. So what I've done was I've come up with a really simple way to characterize chronic illness. These are health conditions that typically have these three characteristics. They're unpredictable, which means people have flare-ups and remissions. They're invisible, which means often their symptoms can't be seen. And they're also long-lasting, which means, in many cases that they're incurable. And if you wanted to think of an acronym, I use the acronym UILL, U-I-L-L, unpredictable, invisible, and long-lasting. And when you look at these characteristics, they take in a lot of illnesses, everything from arthritis, diabetes, heart disease, cancer in some cases, and of course, many mental illnesses as well, from depression to anxiety.
Jason, how widespread are these illnesses?
Well, Nina, that's actually a very tough question to answer specifically and accurately, because the incidence of chronic illness is growing so dramatically that it's really difficult to get a beat on it. But we do know it's very large. Now, the biggest studies, both in the United States and Canada, were done between 5 and 7 years ago, showing that about a third of the workforce had at least one chronic condition. Now, there have been smaller studies done since then showing that the number has actually risen to close to 50% of the people that you work with every day. And, even if we are conservative and we go with the 1 in 3 number, that means that when you're in your organization, if you're at your desk or in your office, if you have 3 people pass by or you see 3 people in a group talking, likely one of those 3 people is sick.
Wow. So I imagine with numbers like that, we're not just talking about workers with chronic health conditions, but their managers likely are sick too.
Well, exactly. Chronic illness does not discriminate. It can attack your most valuable knowledge workers. I know there's a real concern for people in engineering and software firms, obviously, because it can affect the work of people who are highly skilled. And obviously you mentioned managers and even executives. So there's really nowhere that chronic illness doesn't touch. Interestingly, young people are suffering from chronic conditions more than they ever have before. Mm-hmm. And, it's even becoming a huge problem in the third world. So it's not even an issue that companies can outsource, for instance. It's a problem that we have to come to grips with in our organization.
Wow. So through your research and experience, how does chronic illness affect the bottom line of an organization?
Well, typically most organizations see the pain in their benefit plans, because when people get chronic conditions, they go to their doctor more often, they take more medications, which we know is quite expensive. And sometimes they also need expensive treatments, like biologics, for instance, or other treatments that are really pricey. But really what we're finding is that these costs, even though they're significant, are just the tip of the iceberg. There's this whole area of the impact on work performance and productivity, which in some cases, like presenteeism, is not easy to measure, but it really does have a large impact.
Listening to what you're saying, is it fair to say the cost of chronic illness is just as significant when it comes to productivity in the workplace?
Well, we know through studies like the one done by the Milken Institute in 2007, this is a massive study, probably the largest one done on chronic illness in the workplace. And they found that treatment costs were only about 25% of the costs that organizations bear when it comes to chronic illness. Long-term disability costs are rising both in North America and Europe. And part of this is due to the fact that we don't really have a flexible system to keep the people with these skills productive and working in their field when they get sick. So that's one area. Another area is absenteeism. Most benefit managers can identify absenteeism as an issue because it's tracked. But often what isn't tracked is the reason for the absenteeism, especially if people are, only off for a day or two here and there. And often these issues with absenteeism can actually be the result of a flare-up of chronic illness. But perhaps the biggest cost is what some people in the HR field call presenteeism. And this is where an employee is physically at work, but they're not as productive as they usually would be because they're in pain, or they're fatigued, or they're nauseated. So when you add these costs up, the results are really staggering. If we go back to that Milken study I spoke about, it showed that the productivity loss due to chronic illness was more than $1 trillion in 2007. Now, $1 trillion is a huge amount of money, as you can imagine. So one of the things I mentioned to people to get their brains around it is that $1 trillion could pay every residential rent check in the United States for 3 whole years.
Jason.
That's a lot of money. And that's
a lot of money.
It is. And that's what chronic illness cost businesses back in 2007. But what the really interesting thing is that if you look at their projections for the year 2013, which is next year, it is estimated to be $2 trillion. So what's happened is this cost has doubled in 6 years, which is quite incredible. And for those of you who are listening in Canada, productivity costs due to chronic illness are somewhere around the $100 billion a year mark. So from a percentage point of view, it's very similar to the United States. Obviously, in Canada, we have a smaller economy. But what we're talking about here ultimately is a significant percentage of our gross domestic product. So this is really a major economic issue that unfortunately I think in a lot of ways has been overshadowed by some of the other obviously more pressing financial issues out there. But, make no mistake, this chronic illness productivity cost is going to grow sharply as the population ages. It's like a freight train that we can't really stop. So we're going to have to take measures to deal with it, slow it down, and our organizations have to realize they really do have to come to grips with chronic illness in the workplace if they want to survive.
It's becoming something we really can't ignore.
Exactly.
Thanks, Jason. So we're going to take a short break and come back to talk with you about some of the challenges companies face when dealing with chronic conditions. But first, I'd like to ask our listeners, that's you, to send us an email with any questions or comments you may have. This podcast is for you, so please contact us at podcast@sickwithsuccess.com and let us know if you have a comment or a question. Please include your name and where you're writing from so that we can acknowledge your input. We love to hear from you, and we're back in 30 seconds.
If you have enjoyed this podcast and are interested in more information about engaging workers with health problems, please check out Jason's new book, Thriving in the Age of Chronic Illness, available at Amazon.com in both traditional print and Kindle versions. To order it from our website, go to sickwithsuccess.com.
By now, you're probably eager to hear more about chronic illness and its effect on the workplace. Specifically because Jason mentioned more than a third of our coworkers have at least one chronic health condition. That means that of every 3 people who walk by your desk, one of them is most likely sick. Jason, when you shared that with me, I was shocked, I have to say, and I'm sure many of you, our listeners, are too. It's scary to think so many people around us are sick. So why isn't this more noticeable?
Well, you've brought up a really good point here, and it's a real challenge for us when we're dealing with these issues because we can't see them. And, there is a gap between what we perceive in our workplace and what we statistically know is true. And this is due to the fact that chronic illness, for the most part, is invisible. Most of these diseases you can't see when somebody is sick. And the other issue is that a lot of people who have these conditions are actually afraid to talk about them because they don't believe they will be understood and they worry about being stigmatized or discriminated against in many areas.
So if the HR professional or the line manager can't see when a person's ill, then the only way they'd know if a person is sick is if they actually talk about it.
That's exactly right. And, there's a number of reasons why, again, people don't come forward. Number one is worried about being misunderstood. And in a lot of ways, they're worried about not being believed because many of us have grown up believing that illness is something that we can see. So if you have a chronic condition that isn't obvious or doesn't show, you worry that if you bring this up, you're not going to be believed. So that's one reason. Another reason is that for the most part, again, our organizations don't acknowledge the realities of chronic illness. We generally don't want to acknowledge the fact that illness can be unpredictable, invisible and long-lasting. And employees understand this, so that's one of the reasons why they don't come forward, because they feel they'll be misunderstood. And they also worry about, that saying that they're sick could jeopardize their job or future promotions or even their relationships with their coworkers.
Jason, don't most organizations have wellness programs or employee assistance plans to help their employees? Because if people are concerned about their manager or coworker knowing they're sick, then doesn't it make sense that they wouldn't want to use these things?
Well, that's exactly right. A lot of the people who most need these programs don't use them, or don't use them at a point where it would make the most sense for them. What generally happens with people who have chronic illness is it's not until the illness gets so bad that they pretty much have to go on short-term disability that they're willing to communicate the fact that they're sick. So what happens is, even though companies have spent a lot of money on these resources, they're not being used necessarily by the people who need them the most. And people pay a lot, companies pay a lot for these resources. And when they're not being used, it's a waste. So this is something that organizations are going to want to look into.
Jason, we're almost out of time here. Can you give us an idea of what managers can do to encourage their employees to actually come forward?
Well, obviously trust is a really big factor in any of these elements. Employees really feel like they should be able to trust their manager before they come forward. But before you can even have trust with the employee, the manager really has to be open to understanding the characteristics of chronic illness and acknowledging the fact that, it is different than getting the flu. The truth is, we grow up with very set ways of viewing illness. When we were kids, when somebody was sick, again, it was visible. Things were much simpler. And if somebody actually did get an incurable illness back when we were kids, it often meant that they were, either unfortunately going to die, or at least, we felt that person wouldn't be able to function in the workplace. But we really have to train our managers and other people in our organizations to realize that chronic illness is really becoming the new normal in a lot of ways. And if we start communicating and acknowledging those realities and managing expectations so that many people can still work at their jobs and be productive, I think that's really going to help organizations. And the solution to any large problem, and this is a large problem, has to start with the first step. And I really think education and training is probably the best first step to take.
Makes a lot of sense, Jason. We thank you, and thank you to our listeners. We are eager to hear from you, so please send us your questions or your comments to podcast@sickwithsuccess.com. That's sickwithsuccess.com, all one word. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe so that you get regular updates and information about our new episodes. Also, please rate us on iTunes and leave a review if you're able. We really appreciate it.
The most effective way to deal with chronic illness and invisible disabilities in the workplace is to train your staff, starting with your managers and supervisors. Sick with Success has the right training plan for you. From engagement and awareness training to energy management seminars, Sick with Success can provide your organization with information and skills you can't get anywhere else. Please check us out at www.sickwithsuccess.com.
You want this experience to be interesting and informative, and so do we. Please write to us and let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. In our next podcast, we'll be taking a closer look at what chronic illness is and what leaders need to know about it. I'm Nina Bell for Jason Reed. Until next time, may you find health and success.